House of Killers. His heart beat so hard. He felt it rebound against the floor as he pressed his chest against the blood-soaked carpet. He had long stifled his breathing, afraid of each sound's potential to betray him. His vision was partially obscured by the trailing blanket and his grandmother's quilt that raggedly hung over the edges of his parents' bed, held down now by dangling arms and legs. The door to the room was closed now. After the men came in and did this to his family, they closed the door as if they'd hidden it all away. Ironically, that almost described how he felt now. Thrown away, abandoned by the world that he once knew was full of possibility and warmth. He now knew his grandpa's stories, the ancient and newfound horrors he'd recounted to be painfully true and normal for this world. His hands clawed at the carpet as he attempted to pull himself from the darkness. He did his best to ignore those things which made him want to retreat. The squelching wetness of blood between shaky fingers. Air that was too cold and contrasted against the warm mire he lay in. He heard the knob tremble and scurried back under the bed to hide. No sooner had he made himself still than a pair of feet, dressed formally in designer dress shoes, appeared with a pair of bare feet, almost lifelessly dangling in front of him. The person walked to the bed, seemingly strained. It seemed as if he was carrying the body of the second person. The body was thrown on the bed and the person pulled something out of his clothes, maybe from his coat. He leaned forward, putting his weight onto the bed. The young boy coiled up and covered his mouth, choking down tears. He averted his eyes, clenching them so tightly that they burned. He tried to cover his ears next, wishing to muffle the sound of grinding flesh. The sound persisted, falling through the spaces between his fingers, and blood soaked the mattress and bled through and produced a rain of warm gore. The smell of copper and rusty iron saturated the air, barely hiding another waning smell. Perfume. It was sweet and light, fluttering about like a dying butterfly. The sawing stopped. The boy paused, slowly turning his eyes towards the door. There was nothing. The door was closed and the man with the good shoes was gone. A deep sense of panic fell over him. Where did the man go? Or how about his victim and the blood and the gore? He wondered if he should take the opportunity to run as fast as he could. That idea was silenced by the door opening yet again, this time violently, and with enough force to dent the wall with the knob. In the doorway stood a woman with half of her face painted in deep red. Her hair was long and curly, blonde and dirty. She wore a white dress that barely had any white left to it from the dirt and blood covering it. Her bare feet struck the ground as she bolted across the room and jumped to the bed. Her cackling laugh went off like firecrackers in his ears as she struck something. Muffled screams hit the walls, but faded as she continued to strike. Other people, dressed as this woman was, charged into the room, yipping and hollering as they each crashed down over the bed and joined the woman in the assault. The sound of squelching strikes filled the room alongside the maniacal laughter. The boy trembled. His body and senses went into a panic as he came to the realization of what was happening above him. His fingers gripped into the carpet, filling his nails with crimson as he propelled himself from under the bed. Through a curtain of struggling limbs he escaped, never caring enough to look back to see if he was being followed. He just finally reached the tipping point, couldn't stand the nightmare anymore, of listening to saws and knives and guns and the cries and anguish of their victims. It was all just way too much, and it had to stop. Into the front room he ran, leaving a trail of bloodied steps as he hit the floor with his unhalted stride. His fingers fumbled over the knob as he seemed to lose all the coordination needed to perform the simple task. Soft whispers escaped his mouth, and he noticed the door was locked. Behind him, a soft chuckle tickled his ears, and a pair of hands grasped his shoulders, arresting him in place. It was the woman and the well-dressed man from earlier. They peered into his face with the biggest smiles he had ever seen. The woman moved her hand down to his back, pushing him forward through a now opened door. He quickly pulled his vision forward, preparing himself to run into the door, and to his surprise, there was nothing there. And even more surprising, he was now in the room again. On the bed sat a man with eyes of cold malice and a long and lingering physique. He was leaning forward, his arms rested on his knees, head drooping in a relaxed fashion and his teeth showing and sinister grinning. This was Jevin, laughing and amused at visions of his younger self, at a time in which he was just molting his innocence. Behind the young Jevin, a lanky horror with rows of sharp fangs hovered behind him. From his mouth came a hymn of haunting chittering and scratching. That song echoed through the room, finding its way out of the young man's mouth and into the ears of Jevin's true self, who was now burying his head between his knees, laughing in a deep tone, slowly revealing his eyes that glowed in azure embers.